And when we think about developing leaders for United, we are really looking at developing that enterprise first mindset. And how do we help them better adjust and recognize the overall business context and then adapt their part of the organization to do that?
Hello, this is Pete Steinberg, and you are listening to the Leadership Shock podcast. That goes along with the book Leadership Shock, which was recently published. We're going to be talking today about leadership transitions in this episode of Leadership Shock, and I'm really excited to have a long term colleague and the Chief Learning Officer of United Airlines, Maria Taylor, to join us today. Maria, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Pete. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
So let's start. We're going to be talking about leadership transitions today, Maria. But let's start. So let's start with your leadership transitions. Tell us a little bit about your career and where you ended up where you are.
Thank you, Pete. I am currently, as you said, the Chief Learning Officer for United Airlines. And I started my career with an MBA in finance. I've done stints in the corporate banking and corporate finance arena, as well as in executive education for Carnegie Mellon and Penn State University. And then also was Director of Learning Solutions for Raytheon and Raytheon Professional Services. Actually, most of my career, I've been in client-facing roles.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because here you are. You have an internal role, which I think is really interesting. So, talk to us a little bit as you've gone through that. What some of the leadership challenges that you faced in those different transitions?
Yeah, every time you make a transition to an organization, I think there are three challenges. One is really understanding the organization, the industry, the market. The second is understanding the role. Like, what role is this? And then the hardest one, I always believe, is understanding the specific organizational dynamics and how do you get things done in that particular organization. And that's the more subtle, difficult one, in my opinion.
Now, you're now the chief learning officer at United. So is that when you come into a very big organization, which is United Airlines, and you come in as the chief learning officer, which is a central role, is that dynamics? Was that one of the biggest challenges that you had when you came into the role?
It actually was one of the biggest challenges because I did not know the aviation industry. I didn't know the airline industry. I knew parts of the industry, but not all of it. And then the sheer volume and scope of the role was difficult. And I actually work with, I consider our business partners to be internal clients. So I had to learn six, seven different parts of the business in a very in depth way.
Yeah, I mean, because I think they say United Airlines is it's sort of like there's a catering business, there's a facilities business, there's a customer service business. There's so many functions and tens of thousands of employees. It is just huge, and each of those business partners you work with do very different things.
Absolutely. Right now, we have 105,000 employees and 70,000 business partners. So that's a big scope. We're running a global 24/7 airline, and we service over 500,000 passengers each day.
Wow.
So the sheer scope and complexity of running an airline is a lot to get your head around. And then in the airline industry, we deal with the pace that is 24/7 and measured in minutes.
Yeah,
So
that's
that
right.
was a
That's right.
challenge.
Yeah, because if people are 10 minutes late, that matters, right? Like this is the funny thing. The interesting thing I think about the airline business is the metrics are so absolute.
Oh,
It's crazy.
well, it is crazy. I mean, one of our biggest metrics is D0, which is do you depart on time? And our NPS is directly correlated to on time departure and on time arrival.
One of the things that I think's been interesting in your role as the chief learning officer at United is that the role has actually changed in the 5 years that you've been there. And that's another part of leadership transitions. So there's leadership transitions into a new role, there's leadership transitions into a new business or a new organization, but there's also the role that you're in, that transitioning. Can you talk a little bit about what it's been like transitioning as the chief learning officer role and global learning has changed in your 5 years?
In the last 5 years, when I joined, I started in the first ever chief learning officer role. That was a new role. And the goal was and still is to optimize, centralize the training at United and to ensure that we had best in class learning. So the first year we were in a growth mode. And then you all may remember March of 2020 when the global pandemic
Had a bit of an
impacted us,
impact on the business, a little bit
had
of
a
an
bit of an impact of
impact
the
on the business. Yeah.
business. And so we very quickly reacted to that. But during that time, we still had to keep training. We still had operations open. So we did a very quick and agile transition. And then within a year, we quickly recognized that the airline industry would rebound and started making plans to grow and become the biggest and best airline in the history of aviation. So the past 5 years have felt like at least three, if not more, major transitions. While we always have the North Star of being the best in class learning organization, the tactics have changed quite a bit.
So, so how do you, as a leader, navigate those changes? Like, what do you do as the context around you changes? I think COVID's maybe an extreme example, but there are other changes in industry. For you, changes if United changes in regulation. How do you manage as a leader? Like, what's your thought process when some of these changes are happening that allow you to still be effective?
Yep. Two things simultaneously. One, always understanding your organizational North Star. What does good look like for your organization as a whole? And continuing to build to that. The second is really staying abreast of the business context and how your role completes that business context. But that means you do have to change your tactics, often your strategy and tactics to be responsive in the moment. So it's all around leadership agility. But to me, it's having those two pillars of knowing what your good looks like for your organization and what the business context is.
And I think that's something, we've worked together for many years. And I think that's something that you always bring to your roles, which is often unusual in the world of talent and HR, is that business centricity. So it's not about the training and the learning process. It's actually about how those things support the business. And it's interesting that that to you is sort of the grounding, right? It's not necessarily the learning organization, but it's actually what are we trying to do to help the business and help the business be most effective. I think that's a mindset, an interesting mindset in that talent and human resource business. And it's something that you don't often see in the role that you have.
Absolutely. And when we think about developing leaders for United, we are really looking at developing that enterprise first mindset and how do we help them better adjust and recognize the overall business context and then adapt their part of the organization to do that. And finally, to look cross functionally and how do we work together cross functionally to adapt to create business solutions.
Yeah, I think that to me, that cross-functional piece is really important, especially as you become more senior in organizations. And you said something else that I think is really important as you become more senior, which is you have to understand your organizational dynamics and how to get things done early on in your career. Cause and effect is pretty direct. Like I do, I can fix something, right? I can build something. But the further away you get from direct impact on the operations, the harder it is to actually see that cause and effect. And it is so much through influence and through relationships. In the world of United, when you have I mean, 7,000 business partners or 70,000 business partners. Um, how do you manage those different dynamic, like those relationship dynamics, and especially as reorganizations happen? How do you manage the dynamics so you can get things done across your business partners?
We do a lot of work, and I'm usually not directly involved in the relationships with the business partners, although we do support with training and standard and SOP. Um, One of the key organizational challenges is understanding who needs to be involved in what decision and what solution. So, from that extent, we're trying to develop personally as well as develop our leaders to recognize who needs to be in upfront and what decision rights do they have.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, what I talk about is intentionality. So being really intentional about which stakeholders you engage when in the solutioning process, I think is really critical. Um, so we've talked a lot about United and your role there, but I actually want to dive into like your expertise and your experience around leadership development. That's where you've spent most of your career. You've talked a little, you shared the three challenges that leaders have when they transition. How do you help leaders? How can an organization help leaders prepare for those transitions?
The first thing I think organizations should do as they're deciding who to promote or who to hire is to really assess how agile and what their learning capacity is. Now, that's much easier to say than to do because many successful leaders don't have a learning agility. Um, so that's the first thing. Then, secondly, being very explicit about what their new role looks like, what success in that new role looks like, and helping to support them. I think two of the things that I see leaders do most frequently that are mistakes in a new role, especially those promoted from within, is they rely on the tactics and the thinking that they used in their last role, and they very quickly start bringing solutions without asking the right questions.
Yeah, that's well, you're talking the language of the authentic leadership model that's in the Leadership Shock book, because you've said, look, people get into leadership shock because they don't change the way they lead. They don't change their tactics, right? How they lead. And that's how you can get into leadership shock. But the authentic leadership model is explicit about understanding your role and where you want it to get to, which I think is great. But um, this added piece of like getting to solutions too quickly. What do you think drives a leader to do that, to want to bring those solutions before they truly understand their new context or their new role?
Most leaders have been recognized throughout their career for their expertise. They are recognized for being good experts, and they're recognized for being decisive and solving problems. Now, that doesn't go away, but how you actually decide, scope a problem, involve stakeholders needs to evolve over your career. And many organizations don't reward that or train leaders how to do that.
So that's interesting. I think that's right. Do you At what point does a leader stop becoming responsible for the solution and start becoming responsible for the people that are developing the solution? And how do you transition to that? Because I think that's often sort of like the moment where someone goes from being a manager to a leader. You-
That is an interesting question. I don't know I would pose it exactly that way. I might reframe it a little bit to say, when does a leader stop from being solely responsible for the answer and more responsible for using and developing the talent? Because the more senior you are, you're still responsible for the answer, but how you how you scope that answer and scope the stakeholders involved in the answer is more important. And then you also become more responsible for developing how your leaders think and how they come to solutions.
So that's really interesting. And it's a great way of framing it, Maria, which is sort of if I'm a C suite executive, actually, my resources are my executive team. That's my resource. And my ability to do my job is really driven by leveraging that group. So talk about how people in talent and learning and development, chief learning officers, what's their role in helping the senior leaders maximize their the talent that they have available to get to the business outcomes that they're trying to get to.
The chief learning officer's role is to understand what the business dynamics are and then to help the leadership team frame how we want to operate together, make decisions together, and then help to develop that capability inside the organization. And so it's how we structure decisions, how we interact with each other, and then help to build the skills and the capability to do that.
Yeah, I love that idea of capability development. Like this is about building a capability that sits within the organization. And the reason why I like that is that capability may not sit within an individual, right? So capability could be a team, right? It could be a function. Like I think that idea of capability and helping organizations develop capabilities, just like you are helping them develop a plant or a product, right? Or like a sales methodologies. These are all capabilities that the firm or the organization has to meet their business goals. I love that concept of building talent capabilities as a process. I, you touched on something a little bit earlier that I want to go a little bit deeper in, and it's something that's come up a number of times in conversations I've had with clients and also in some podcasts I've been doing as part of the PR for the book, which is around leadership selection. And maybe I can share a hypothesis with you, Maria, and you can react to it. I think we have a measurement challenge when it comes to leadership in the sense that we tend to measure outcomes and not process. And so what tends to happen is that like the person that sells the most, the best salesperson becomes the head of sales, and that's because we can measure, right, how much they've sold, and it's actually really hard to measure what kind of leader they they can be. And so therefore some organizations are making choices not based on the right things for the role, but based on the things that we can measure, right? And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts around that leadership selection process and whether you think my metric hypothesis like stands up to scrutiny.
I absolutely agree with your metric hypothesis
Okay, thank
because
you.
we can measure sales, operational metrics. What we don't measure well is how well leaders develop leaders while being held accountable for results. So it's really twofold: accountability for results and development of the leadership process, culture, accountability, and process. And
Yeah,
so often a leader will get promoted. They will be a fantastic operator at the lower level, and they get promoted out of their capability, not their expertise or intellectual capability, but out of their ability to get things done through others. Often it shows as micromanaging because they're not comfortable not knowing all of the details and
yeah.
not relying on all of their team and knowing when to stay at this high visionary strategic level versus diving down to solve an immediate problem.
Yeah, I that transition from the expertise and the self identity, right? Of like, I am good because I know something to I am good because I develop people is a really interesting one. And it's they're not binary in at least in my experience. And I'm working with a C-suite executive right now who she's really challenged with not being the expert, and she's in the C-suite of a large organization. And so it's really hard for her to talk about things that she doesn't have full knowledge and understanding of. And I think that transition is really difficult. How what can organizations do to help leaders think differently like that, to be able to think more, to get out of their area of expertise and think more like leaders, and then eventually think like enterprise-wide leaders?
Yeah. I think one of the things that that organizations can help leaders do is in their leadership development is to give them practice recommending strategic innovations, or enterprise solutions, working in teams with a number of other leaders, whether that's addressing key problems, whether it's through leadership development program. But it helps build that acumen of I need to learn quickly how to assess a situation, assess a business need, and then recommend and develop a solution for business impact.
So that's a little bit different. I mean, you're talking about sort of like in the old days, we would call it action learning, right? You're talking
Right.
about real problems, right? That the organization is facing and bringing this cross-functional team. What advantage does that have over like the more traditional, like case-based development process?
I think case based development has a value. There is a value in that because you're learning the skills, the thought process, and you're applying them in a way that has no risk, really, other than the immediate, maybe you have the wrong answer. I think the project based development takes it a step further. Um, I know, Pete, you and I have talked about this for a long time, but leaders don't get a practice field, and finding ways to give them a practice field is important. Now, when I'm talking about some of these strategic challenges or development projects, it gives them a practice field applied to the organization along with other leaders. And so it's a important tool in developing leadership capability. And the organization gets real impact as well.
Well, I think that's one of the things, as a vendor that sells to clients, the benefit of this is that the outcome is you have better leaders, but also you might have a couple of solutions that you hadn't thought of to business problems that you have, right? So there's direct value. The other thing, and I think this is maybe more true than it used to be, is that um, people like senior leaders don't want to waste their time. Now, learning isn't wasting time, right? But they are much more engaged. They're much more likely to engage in a process where there's a real problem. And in particular, when they actually get a say in what the solution is and potentially have that say at the C-suite. Now, you've done this at United. Can you talk a little bit about um, what's worked well and what some of the challenges have been about bringing this sort of project-based enterprise-wide leadership process to United?
At United, when we do a strategic challenge, and we also still do action learning projects, so and have had great success with them. In fact, have gotten ideas that have been implemented across all areas of the business. So what works well is using a structured process and a structure that is appropriate for the level of leader you're developing, anywhere from one of our senior manager or director programs up through very time bound strategic challenges at the E team or intact team level. What works is that you're creating a common language, you're giving people an approach that asks them to think differently and focuses on it. One of the challenges is the scoping and having the right time. I think the key to really implementing a strategic challenge or an action learning project is to scope the project so that it's important for the business, that there is actually a willing sponsor, and that may be an E team member or an officer, as well as giving the group the right breath to innovate and apply different thinking.
That's great. Well, Maria, thank you so much for your time today and sharing some of your insight. It's been really great to hear your thoughts on leadership, hear a bit about what's going on at United, and to gain some of those insights around leadership transitions. So, a couple of things that I think we heard today from Maria is this concept of not changing your tactics and trying to get to solutions too quickly as a new leader. I love this idea of finding a practice field where, as a leader, you can develop and you can try things that are new. And also, this idea of being really focused on the business outcome, and then leveraging talent and talent capability as being really, really important. So this is a reminder of the Leadership Shock podcast. You can get Leadership Shock, the book, on Amazon. You'll find a link to that in the show notes. I would like to thank Maria. And just a reminder that there's a series of these episodes around Leadership Shock. So please check them out. Don't forget to subscribe, and please leave a great review for the podcast. Thank you for taking time with us today, Maria. And thank you for all the listeners.
Thank you, Pete. Always a pleasure.